Welcome to the Liminal Space podcast. This is episode 3. I'm Rashid.
I'm Tristan, and today we're going to talk about education and a bunch of other cool stuff. So, Rashid, let's talk about high school.
Yeah.
I went to, as you know, I grew up in East London.
Yeah.
And I went to a very typical coloured primary school in my neighbourhood in East London. And then when I went to high school, I went to a former Model C school, which was across town. And that was the first time I actively shared space with white people on a day-to-day basis. And I was in that generation of people that I wasn't the first person of color at the former Model C school. There had been others before me, but there were very few. We were in the minority. And so I think for that generation of people, there is a specific kind of racial trauma, I think I would call it. But maybe we can delve into that in another session about what that is. But having access to schooling on the other side of town in a former Model C school, it was challenging. But also at the time, I guess there was a pride in me that I could be there. And it did help me to get to UCT, right? It was a co-ed school, lots of facilities. We had sporting fields, a pool, tennis courts, all of those kinds of things. And I guess one thing that stuck with me from that time was that it made me feel that I'm also entitled to flourishing and a good education like everyone else.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah. So my schooling, I was at the Waldorf School in Constantia from, I think, when I was about 3 years old until matric essentially. So I didn't have different primary school or high school experiences or anything like that. My schooling thing, I mean, it was like a private school in Constantia. It's kind of one of the most privileged schooling experiences you could have in Cape Town. I mean, the education system, won't go into details on that, but in a Waldorf school is quite different to the government sort of education. But one interesting, I guess, dynamic that I had at school was, so it's in Constantia and it's just opposite this road called Strawberry Lane. And Strawberry Lane is famous for, back in the day, there were a lot of colored people who lived there, who were flower sellers and like all sorts of other things. And I actually, my family on my dad's side was born there. And just opposite Strawberry Lane, well, opposite my school as well, there's a mosque and a cemetery there. And I also, like, my grandparents were buried there. Even now, like, if family passes away, they're often buried there. Which is this interesting thing because my family on my dad's side, they suffered from forced removals. So they lived in Constantia in Strawberry Lane. And yeah, it's beautiful there if anyone knows Constantia. And then they were moved to Deep River, and then eventually my dad grew up in Manenberg, where he was at school in high school and everything, at Manenberg High. And then I guess quite simply because of white privilege, because I grew up with my mom, it's almost like I returned to that place where my ancestors were before. Which I guess gives me a bit of hope and imagination for like returnal of forced removals and, flourishing education systems and things like that. But in my instant, the reality was it was white privilege that allowed me to, be in a very beautiful school and a beautiful space. Yeah. Okay,
so today our guests are Ashley and Helene, who are two really cool people. Ashley Visagie is a co-founder of Bottomup, which promotes critical awareness among high school students. Ashley has a deep concern for youth in South Africa who suffer because of the unjust education system and seeks to contest deficit narratives. He is optimistic that a more fair and just world is possible, but also believes that the kind of systemic changes required call for engagements that are not trivial or easily accomplished.
Helene Rousseau is also a co-founder of Bottomup, and she strives to facilitate critical education with young people. She has an interest in dialogical learning and the implementation of culturally responsive teaching. She loves curating resources and materials that are relevant to youth that can further develop their knowledge to promote a better world. So, Helene, Ashley, you are very, very welcome.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
for
us.
having us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So as we usually start, we're recording from Fishhook on a nice sunny autumn day. And Ashley and Helene, we wanted to find out why or how did you come to live in Fishhook?
Right, yeah. So I grew up in Noordhoek, and Fishhoek was our social place of hanging out as children and teenagers, because Noordhoek was a very small place. They're not very developed and not much going on. So your social happenings and things you did and your friends would usually be situated in Fishhoek. And so, yeah, I've got really good memories of Fishhoek and growing up here. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why Fishhoek was a good option for us to come back to. It's I love being around the mountain and the sea and, yeah, being in close distance.
Very nice.
And I followed Helene.
That's brilliant. I feel like you had more of a choice in the matter than just following it.
So as a starting point, as we always begin these episodes with the question, what stories ground you? A question you can obviously interpret in any way you want to.
Yeah, I would say in my childhood and teen years, it was my faith and desire to see God's kingdom realized on earth, and maybe some naivety in that God was the answer to it all, but not really knowing what that means or how that would play out. I think I always felt extremely uncomfortable with this idea of saving people, or this, they had to accept Jesus to go to, a better place when they die. And I don't know, it never sit well with me, but I felt solace in the idea, or a centering of that the gospel is broader than that, and it's also about caring for people and making spaces better for people. And so that was it. It worked for me. It grounded me, and there was things in my faith I could pull from that. But as I've gotten older, I found it much more difficult to hold the majority of what the Christian community believes at the center, and specifically because it often excludes rather than includes people. And so I think it's something I constantly now grapple with. And so it maybe still grounds me in some sense, but not as it did as a child and a teenager. But I think what grounds me really now, and for probably the last 15 years of my life, is being more and more immersed in the communities we work in. It really became a part of my identity and an extension of me, I would say. And I think the stories and the unjust situations that children and parents and teachers found themselves in, that grounds me. I think it took over my mind and my heart in desiring a more just and joyful education. And so I think if I think of just 3 short examples and stories of linking this, what grounds me in the communities, if I think of the child who's alienated in the schooling environment and who doesn't maybe complete their homework and is made to kneel for an hour in the classroom until the period is done, or the teacher who gets up early in the morning and walks through a community picking up the children as she comes to a classroom just to make sure they come to school, or the parent who is an immigrant who can't speak English, can't pay school fees, but is denied the right of her child's school report. So I think stories, and there's millions more of these stories that really ground me in who I am and what I do and what informs the way I live.
Sure. And Ashley, on your side?
Yeah, I think for myself, rather than having overarching narratives or grand stories that ground me, I think I have ideas and values that ground me. Values like justice, fairness, kindness. And I think maybe at another time in my life, even when I was younger, a lot of this, like Helene's, was framed around Christianity. Maybe that as possibly an overarching story. When we pray, for example, for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven, or we think about the idea or concept of a new earth, it's all about a world in which um, everyone has what they need. The way we relate to each other is more human, I think. And whilst I don't necessarily, when I talk to people, articulate what I think or what I believe in those ways anymore, using those ideas or metaphors or concepts, I think I still strongly am anchored by those values, fairness, justice, kindness, and so on. And I think it's about now, for me, almost a struggle to become more human in the world, and the realization also that is almost connected to everything else that's happening in the world. So how can we be free ourselves or liberated ourselves when someone down the road doesn't have food, you know? So you said we started by talking about sitting in Fishhoek, but what's happening in Fishhoek is inextricably linked to what's happening in Ocean View and Masipumelele. You know, these communities are, or at least Fishhoek is dependent actually on the poverty that's happening in these spaces. And so I think I haven't always lived in Fishhoek. I mean, I grew up in Retreat, lived in different parts of Cape Town, but I think becoming conscious of those relationships, you realize that is you want to struggle or work towards a world where we don't have those kinds of broken relations, not broken relations, but exploitative, extractive relations between each other. Yeah.
So it sounds like also something you're saying is almost like becoming more human means accepting that all of these interconnectedness is there or happens. Or we have there's more scope for us to be human in understanding that interlinkage, I guess.
Yeah, I want to become a good person in the world. But, you know, where do I buy my clothes? Or the food that I eat, who makes it? And when you begin to see all of those relationships and how you are implicated yourself, then I think that almost you have to be invested in trying to unravel those things, some of which kind of we have different roles. So as someone who, I don't know, under apartheid system, I would have been classified as a colored person. So on one hand, you are part of the community of the oppressed, but on the other, you're also a beneficiary of these unjust systems in the way in which I located in terms of class structures, for example.
Yeah. What's interesting is that you both mentioned your faith background in some kind of way, although it's changed over the years, is still something that anchors you. So there's something about that time that has stayed with you until now, although it's evolved and developed in how you engage the world.
Yeah, I would say that even though there was this exclusiveness almost of a fundamentalist Christian upbringing, but it was a very caring environment, and it was also an environment where the people of faith around me really put a lot of value in children and the idea that they can contribute meaningfully in the space that we find ourselves in. And I think that has probably been a thread that has kept on. So whilst there was things that in hindsight I look and I go, oh my goodness, what are these people thinking? But there's some things that were really meaningful and still really beautiful, even though it's really intertwined with the things that are not okay.
I wanted to say it's very interesting, like picking up on something that both of you were saying, this idea of being caring, I guess, in a community. And then, Helene, you said that, and then you also said there's this exclusivity, which is such an interesting thing, because I think that, to tie with what Ashley was saying, I think that a lot of the time how we operate in the world is we find to be loving to people who are like us, who look like us, who speak like us, who think like us, who believe the same things as us, but that realizing that connectedness, that we are part of a bigger world, part of a bigger city. I like what you were saying, Ashley, about how Fishhoek is related to just the few like Masiphumelele, you mentioned, for example, the informal settlement, which is 5 kilometers from here, maybe 5-10 kilometers from here, and just that connectedness between everything. So in the caring, I guess, that idea of caring, you can just be caring to your neighbors in Fishhook, but acknowledging that I actually have neighbors beyond that. So even Ashley, you're talking about that idea of liberation. I've actually been thinking about it a lot this weekend, about how our liberation is bound up with the liberation of our neighbor. And a lot of the time it's easy for us if we look at that neighbor as someone who thinks like us, who believes the same things that we do. But when we acknowledge our humanity and we realize that neighbor could be someone who's so different from us, but let us seek their liberation as we seek our own. It's an idea.
Yeah, I think on what you were saying around, what is this kind of in between space around, being a Christian and what is it that I hold on to from that part of my life. And I think it is the people, actually. I think if I think back to the experience that I've had in the church, is that there were people that I think genuinely did care about other people. And that was expressed in particular ways, some of which I think was very useful, and some of which I think is maybe problematic or paternalistic or anchored in some kind of concept of, saving people from something, but not really saving them from this reality that they're experiencing now. And I think that idea of people that actually care, that would be working late hours of the evening, early hours of the morning, on things that they were going to go and do, to go and actually support other people, availing themselves, making their time available, their resources available. And you do see that within the context of the church also. I think for me, maybe what has changed or what has been added, maybe, I don't know, is trying to hold on to that concept of care, but also to add into it an element of criticality. How do we actually think deeply about how the world works? How is society organized? And so it's not acts of charity that I'm interested in anymore, about going in and doing X, but you're not actually addressing the underlying root causes of what holds things in place. Both what's happening in one part of the city and in another part of the city. So I think it's bringing in that kind of critical edge to say, we can express care in a way that's actually more profound by undoing and dismantling the system.
That's so interesting. I think this, it parallels, I think, what you both have explained about the bottom-up story and how you got involved with bottom-up, starting with that thing about caring for people and then how that evolution happened. So maybe we can talk about that for a bit, about okay, so let's go back to when did bottom-up start? How did it start? And then, because I think often people will say, someone like Ashley or Leon who have your views now, somehow you just magically appeared to have these views all of a sudden in all of its fullness. But I mean, that's not true. Most of the time there's some kind of journey and process, and I think it's good to understand that process for you both as well. So maybe we can go back to the beginning of Bottom-up, and I guess for some people who don't know what Bottom-up is, maybe you can also say a little about the actual things that you get involved with as well.
Okay, so I think Bottom-up started in 2007. Ashley and I were both undergraduates at the time, and we also met, I think, just about a year before that, but also realized we had a lot of things in common and this desire to do good, and to really also had a passion to work with children and youth. And it's actually started a after-school program at a children's home in Wynberg, And from there, we had some friends who were involved, and we decided it made sense to form a non-profit organization. And it kind of just started from there, with no formal funding. We would do some concerts and things, and there was I think in Rondebosch there was a
open mic
night, and once Thursday per month they would say all the tips, or I don't know, I can't remember. We had to organize the bands, but then they would give us like a certain amount for organizing the evening, and so we kind of ran off that for quite a while, and then we got to a point where we're like, so what can we do that can, reach more children? And we thought, well, it makes sense to look at the school spaces. The first school we identified was Constantia Primary, which was kind of a strange school because it's in Constantia. But
Rashid's neighborhood.
Yeah, not far from Waldorf, just down the road. Yeah. It serves the farm workers' children in the community. And it was a very small school. We also looked for a small school because we also looked at our capacity. I think they were only like 150 or 200 students, so it was very small and easy to work with. But yeah, also the fees were 200 Rand for the whole year. So we went there first. And I think the idea of Bottomup as the name is we really did want to take in consideration what is the needs at the bottom and how do we meet that, and rather coming with the idea, this is what we'd like to do in your school. And of course, at that time, we didn't know too much about what are good ideas to do in schools and things. But schools, the first thing they wanted was a physical education program. And we're like, yeah, we can do that.
While you're there, the reason, well, maybe for both of you, the reason you are getting involved in this kids program is, you're saying part of it is your church background, but also your undergrad was...
Yes, so I did social work. Studied social work, and I think I've always wanted to work in the field, with children. It's always been a passion of mine to work with children, but I think after doing social work, I didn't really want to go into child protection, though I did do it for a year of my life, but didn't feel very meaningful, and I felt being in the education space, you could really create meaningful change for children that actually really affects their daily lives, that can improve it and make it more joyful, and also to help them get to the next part of life more successfully. So we started that, and I think we started writing small funding proposals and started getting a bit more money in, and then started expanding our schools. And then I think we took this idea of, well, whatever schools we go to, we're going to the ones that have no NGO help. We don't want to go to an NGO hub, and because there's many of them where there's like an influx of so many NGOs, and then there's schools that just had no support. And we're often advised by the Department of Education, don't go there, you can't have much impact, because the school's just so dysfunctional. But we moved into the Grassy Park area. We took on a few primary schools there. All of them always actually wanted physical education. It's actually interesting. It was the one. I think it's because it was stripped out of the education system.
Right.
Because that was something that was paid for by the state prior 94, and after that, with the budgets having to be reallocated, that was removed as a central part. And it also just gave teachers a minute to breathe when you're taking their children out of the classroom. And there's other, positive impacts of that, where teachers felt students were just better behaved after being able to go out and do some activities and things like that. So that was good. From then on, we did a whole lot of other projects. We started literacy support projects, numeracy support projects, chess clubs, sewing projects, you name it, we tried almost all of it. And I think it was exciting. I think from the I could probably go into why we changed things, but I don't know if Ashley maybe wants to add to that beginning time of Bottomup.
Yeah, because important in that story was you were intervening. You said you'd gone to the schools, they'd identify what they think that they need help with, and you almost then fill the gaps for those things.
Yes.
Okay. So as you're filling the gaps, I guess this other thinking's happening.
Yeah, I think there were we should almost pause a second on your child protection experience as well, because I think there's some lessons out of that year of Helene's child protection experience also that I think also causes shifts in thinking.
Okay.
And even translates even into work in Bottomup, because within that, I mean, you're working within a system, for example, that is designed for, let's say, a normal society or whatever concept of a normal society looks like. But if you were to apply, for example, the Child Protection Act to the T, then you would literally have to remove every child that you encounter on the Cape Flats. You know, everyone is exposed to violence. Everyone is in a situation where they're at risk. So there's those kinds of incongruences, and also kind of even within that system, I think incongruences that you notice as well. So now you've got, you're working with a child maybe that you had to remove, but actually you've got to drive out to Worcester because there's no way to go, you know? And the next thing is you're going to go take them back to the place where they came from. So I think stuff that you noted from that experience that you had, I think we begin to also note even in the work of Bottomup as well, is that you're working within the school context, which is another sector of society, but which is plagued by the same kinds of things. There's systemic issues that's holding everything in place. And you've got a whole bunch of NGOs or people from the community, parents even, all trying to kind of plug gaps within the system, you know, or keep things and to a large extent, I think in some schools, the NGOs do actually keep the schools afloat. So they're coming to provide stationery, delivering paper, running after school extracurricular things, bringing extra support, plugging in counseling services and so on. So you've got everyone kind of bringing this cluster of things, but the reason why you're doing it is because you've got a school system where most of the schools are actually underfunded. They're not being given the resources that they need from the state. But we call it the public schooling system, you know. But I think the way if you talk to people even in, you know, over the supper table, the way that people conceptualize what is public is just like it's underfunded. Maybe it's not an education system that's actually funded and supported by the public system or by public funds. And we need to recover that.
So how do you come to that realization? I guess the more structural, you're doing this bottom-up work that is part of, like you say, in the community, other actors as well, is they're all plugging these gaps, and Bottomup fits into that. In the early days of Bottomup, you're kind of doing sewing projects even and whatever else is coming. So how do you come to that point where you're like, okay, there's something else going on?
Yeah, I think it's over time, and also through relationships with the students themselves, the young people that we work with, and the schools, the teachers. And when you're working with a student that you met in grade 4, when they were in grade 4, and they've been involved in maybe different activities or projects, whatever that Bottomup's been involved in. And for a lot of the students, when we work in primary schools, for example, we saw this massive drop-off. It wasn't guaranteed that everyone was even going to go to high school.
Wow.
So you notice this thing, you know, that you're up against. You see the transformations also in some students where actually the forces that are at play in their lives, in school, in the community and everywhere else, how the child that you taught in grade 4 is actually the one that's walking around with a knife, you know, when they're 16 years old now. That was a story I told you when we were doing the chess class at one school, and someone walked in with a knife and a bunch of guys huffing glue, and then they apologized. Actually, one came back to apologize afterwards
because they saw it was you.
But to see actually how this happens in the course of a space of less than 10 years, you know, or how opportunities foreclose on students. So even those who make it, in the sense, in a community like Parkwood, making it to matric is a big deal. It's a big thing. It's a thing that you celebrate. Parents celebrate it, that you've made it to matric. And so even for the student who, in that sense, makes it in the community, makes it to matric, the realization that, that actually this is like maybe even the end of the line for most students.
Yeah.
There aren't any big possibilities of going to study further or necessarily work opportunities that's going to allow you upward social mobility or to experience a life that, you're not confronted with violence on your doorstep. So the cycle kind of repeats itself. And so I think just working with students long enough and seeing that happen, kind of over and over repeatedly. And also, some of the students that we worked with are dead.
Yeah.
So you have those kind of stories coming through the newspapers. Oh, this one passed away, and sometimes it happens with classmates of young people, and there isn't even really support afterwards. So it's almost like it just happens.
Yeah.
Someone in the class was caught in crossfire, and there's no support services or anything for these students afterwards. So the repeated stories like that, I think, kind of almost like chips away at your, what do you call, idealism or voluntarism, a certain kind of hope that we can, make a difference, And so I still have hope, but it's the kind of hope that we have now is a hope which takes all of those realities into account, I think, and recognizes that the little bit that we do, maybe it makes some kind of a difference in some people's lives, but it doesn't. There's a lot of systemic changes that need to happen, and so we actually need to be working simultaneously on those things.
The idea that hope alone will transform the world, and action undertaken in that kind of naivety, is an excellent route to hopelessness, pessimism, and fatalism. But the attempt to do without hope in the struggle to improve the world, as if that struggle could be reduced to calculated acts alone, or a purely scientific approach, is a frivolous illusion.
Paulo Freire.
I wanted to sort of contextualize this in the context of the city, these big issues. So some of the things that you're talking about, I know we've named it, but just to name it again, it's mainly like schools on the Cape Flats, and this is one side of what's going on in Cape Town. On the other side of what's going on in Cape Town, closer to the mountain, as we spoke in episode 1, there's so much beauty happening in schools, and the things that kids are exposed to, and I guess the imagination for a child to grow up to essentially become whatever they want in the world. I wanted to just highlight that we had in a previous conversation, we were talking a little bit about some of these disparities which can actually be seen and realized on things like the earths of schools, for example. I'm not sure who it was, which one of you mentioned that. Maybe if you wanted to just touch on that. But
yeah, I think there's a number of things that is different between schools that are, let's put it bluntly, schools that were for black, poor youth in South Africa, from colonialism, under apartheid, and also in the present moment even, through our existing policies which keep those things in place. I think the difference is, one was that the size of the school, if you go and look at the size at which the ground in which the school stands is physically smaller than schools that were meant for white people, white middle class young people. And so even the opportunity to expand or to think about like what kind of things does a child need, it was imagined differently for different young people. Some young people, it was imagined that you needed to become a whole person, all around it. You must excel in academics, but you must also be good in sport, and you must, play the piano or whatever it might be. And for the other person, you're almost a shell of a person, and it's kind of doubled down on even in the post-94, where we've, through teacher rationalization and the stripping of things like arts, music, sport, etc., we've kind of fixated on this academic project, which is also unsuccessful. So how do you, what kind of person do you become?
Yeah.
How do you interact and engage in the world? I'm conscious even as I sit here. So I went to a school that was for people of color, and in primary school, and then late primary school I shifted to another school, for example, where we had an art room, we had a library, we had a swimming pool, and there's a number of things there. But even as I sit here, I'm conscious of the ways, that there's parts of me that wants to be able to exist in the world or relate in the world in ways which I don't quite have access to yet, And I think of the child, for example, who wants to express themselves in a song, but they never had the opportunity actually to do that.
Yeah.
And then you hear there's places in the rest of the world, for example, where you have municipal music schools, where the government is paying for you to, everyone who wants to go and do a music lesson after school in the week. It's such inequalities that aren't that obvious or easy to see, as the leaky roofs and the toilets that's not working.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of our awakening came when we were developing chess. I think that was one of the projects we took very seriously, and where kids actually started competing with the schools that are really well funded and were actually getting their Western Province colours. And I think that really started to disrupt what we were seeing. And the children, what they were experiencing was helping us to see this disruption in what we are trying to do. Because just being exposed to a space that they've never been exposed to, but you think everyone knows there are better schools out there, but actually they don't know. So the one story of a grade 4 student where we took him to a school to play a match, and he says he sees there's only white children there. He's like, so why do they make schools so big for white children, and why is our school so small? Asking questions like that, or just a silly one where, but still stark, where you're playing a chess game, why are the white pieces white and why they're black and why they're only on one side and not on mixed
why does
or
the
whatever.
White get to start?
He's like, this is apartheid. Or another chess student also played very well, and just stories that came from him, like saying, my father's a gardener for someone in Bishop's Court, but they have a separate toilet for him. And so even though you know some of these things, but when these children are starting to express these things, and you're like, oh, this world is just, it's messed up, and there's bigger things to play here. And like you said, Ashley, this focus on being academia, we only focus on maths and English and science, and we are going to hit these children dead with maths classes. They're going to do it after school. And it's been proven already by many people that giving students more maths doesn't help them be better at maths. Giving them arts and giving them creative things helps them improve in maths. I think that's what maybe informed some of the things we did, because we realized those are things that make a holistic child. And in that time, I think our vision was to create like pride, identity, belonging for students in schools. That's what we were going for.
Yeah, and all of them were based on, I think, small initiatives, small kinds of pockets of hope or change. And I think the thing that you come to, I think, when you look at or you study the education system, is that actually you need to change the rules of the game, the policies, the mechanisms that actually structure the field. So, and when I say that, even in a small way, if you, maybe I'm stepping back a bit, but even if you think about the chess, going to those tournaments and leagues and so on, you begin to see, okay, you're part of a field of chess or whatever, and this group of students that Len was talking about, they were playing really well. You know, they were primary school chess team, and they were punching way above their weight. I think there was only one other school that would give them trouble when they came to the finals. And if you look at those two schools, here was a group of students that was playing chess, and they had nothing. We had no coaches. Like, we were the coaches with our limited understanding of chess. We were the coaches. All that we were doing was we were saying, okay, you know, if you guys want to play 3 times a week, then we'll come 3 times a week and we'll open up and put the sets out and we can play. And we'll try to bring things for you to watch or read, whatever.
Yeah.
And the other school, when you'd arrive at the tournament, we'd have to, for example, sometimes the players would be sleeping over at our house the night before to ensure that they'd eaten, you know, in the morning, that they we actually had that one time where there was gunshots in the community the night before the tournament, and so the students weren't well rested. So we took them to tournaments, having slept at our place, you know, giving them a meal. We traveling together, so everything sorted out. And then you arrive and you're competing against a team where the school has a chess coach who teaches regularly, a team manager who organizes the admin for the team. Each player is dropped off by their parents in
the parents there for the whole day, actually.
And they're there the whole day.
Yeah.
The players have their own pocket money that they're buying their meals and things with. And there's someone that receives them after each game that is going to look through the game and what mistakes they did, what they could improve. And here we are, you know, from Parkwood, whatever, competing in a tournament like that, where actually the resources are completely unequal.
Yeah.
And so that's maybe like a microcosm, but in education as well, in the field of schooling, it's exactly the same kind of thing, you know. The way in which the field is structured is just completely unfair.
I was also just thinking about, like, the children, they are so used to being lesser than. I was thinking about one game this one girl played. I'm like, you're already on such a lower level playing field.
Yeah.
You're coming from, like, a school hasn't given you the resources. Like, actually, this child being in a wealthy school is an injustice to you, because tax money is still going to help making that school what it is with parent top up. But this child was playing against this one girl from a very wealthy school, and she started losing the girl from the wealthy school, and tears started running down her face, and our student then lost. And I asked her what happened. You were really like a few pieces up. You should have won the game. She said, I felt so sorry for her. She was crying, so I let her win. And I just thought it's amazing, this all the stuff in your life and all this justice that's on you, and then you take that up and you take another thing up that is my responsibility to make this child feel better, when I actually had the ability to be the best in that game.
Sure. I just wanted to say, like, that's an example, such a beautiful example of humanizing. The girl who saw the other girl crying, and this is a girl who's from, like, a privileged school and everything, and you'd expect the other girl to be like, no man, I'm gonna beat you, just watch you cry more. That's how a lot of people, but here you have, like, a child, I'm not sure if a teenager, who's that's such a beautiful example of that humanity, I guess. I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I was talking about that thing of being human as well. Is what I really wanted to say about that was, it's like, if you think of, I don't have children of my own, but if you think of, like, this was your own child and they're living in the Skriverflatse, or they have to sleep a night in the Duivelhok or whatever, like how you would respond. And I think for me it is like, this thing of being human is actually treating everybody in that way, you know, seeing everybody as having that kind of close relation to you. That, you know, if this was, you know, that you had to use that toilet, then like, we're going to deal with this now.
Yeah.
And I think that thing, somehow it isn't there for everybody, that we feel like some people, must receive service now and be helped now, and others can wait.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, the picture you're painting as well about, like, I guess what I'm hearing is like this, there are these, like, there's like, maybe there's more than one school system happening. And one supposes like kids become these fully functioning adults in some kind of way, and the other one is set up where you have to fight all the odds to become this fully functional adult within the system that we're in. And yet, despite that, there are these like this kind of situation where the kid who has all the odds stacked against them displays some kind of humanity that's very different to what all the resources in the world in the city gives you. Something that's distinct, I guess, about Bottomup's work as well is the fact that you're to fight against or to bring change against these systemic things we're talking about is that the children themselves are involved. So you were working with kids within their schools to transform the schooling system. And you both, I don't know, either of you gave that quote about children as, you talk about that all the time, children as co-constructors of the world. Do you want to say something about that? Why is it important that the kids are involved?
Yeah, so that is it's a quote from Vygotsky. It was an idea from Vygotsky. And it's also, there's someone that I'm busy interviewing currently for my studies who often repeats that line, children as co-constructors of the world. And it comes out of their work that they had in what they call the children's movement. So they were a group of people, under apartheid also, who took it on themselves to make a concerted effort to work with and mobilize children, towards some kind of a future vision of a different society. And I think for them it was about this kind of socialist, this vision. But to go back to the idea itself is to recognize that actually, children are not human becomings. They are human beings also. And they have a contribution to make. So even when we think about concepts like democracy and participation, we should really be having and hearing children's voices also. I think, maybe Helene, you want to say
so
that?
it kind of links to when I went to go study a master's in education. Ashley took the policy route and I stuck with the primary education route, and I was really fortunate to be taught by someone who even questions this idea of childhood and child. How do we define that? Why do we have the binary of child and adult? And why is child seen as irrational, and what they're saying is can't be meaningful contributions to the space that they find themselves in. And I think that flipped a lot of what we're thinking of how we move forward in the organization. And then Ashley was getting a lot of the systemic education things in the policy that he was learning. But definitely looking at even though children do not have the spoken or written language like adults, it doesn't mean that they have different ways to contribute. And also that I think generally, and we've seen it, children always actually try to find ways to be more inclusive. Of course, you get things where children are fighting over things, or they want that or don't want to share. But I think generally when you sit down with children and think about how they would like to imagine the world and how it should be, it's always very inclusive. So I like that thing of Loris Malaguzzi. He was a philosopher in early childhood in Italy. And he said children have 100 languages and many, many more, but adults steal 99. And so that, I think that kind of feeds into this idea of child and really having to question that binary of child and adult. And I think if we can start thinking of that differently, we can start seeing children in a different light. I think also where we see children can still be physically abused by adults. Why do we allow that? We frown on adults hitting dogs or abusing their partners, but we don't have that same view that children are treated in that way.
Social or organizational transformation in South Africa requires far less technical solutions than many imagine. The more I reflect, the more it becomes apparent that what lacks most is seeing each other as equally human and deserving. If I were to condense all the reading and studies which I've done in sociology, policy, theology, and leadership, it would converge on this very problem of classification struggles, which may articulate in many ways, including race, social class, and gender. The way to fix a school, a family, or a state should necessarily begin with recognizing that we are all human and deserving. Every policy and practice is a reflection of how seriously an organization or institution believes this.
Understanding the scale of the problem or the issues, what do you suppose, I guess, what is the work that needed to be done in the world? I guess in your experiences working with kids, but also generally, Ashley, you said something on LinkedIn that talks about, I guess, it's almost just treating each other like humans. Like, not that was what I got out of it, was like the work needs to start with us humanizing one another. But in your views, what is that work that has to be done in the world?
I think maybe I'll just come at it like practically, and then talk about maybe try to abstract from there. But I think what we haven't said yet is like there's a turn in Bottomup's work where we began to focus on kind of doing things like youth critical action research, talking about social justice, trying to get students thinking about how power works in society. And I think that turn was quite a significant turn for us, because it was almost saying that we don't feel that we can continue trying to plug gaps. In as much as it's really nice to be able to sit down in the afternoon, and have a game of chess. Like we were saying, like we only have so much capacity. Like what are the ways in which we want to commit our time and our resources, and what kind of work do we want to do? And so for us, that was working together with young people, and almost in a sense democratizing tools of critical thought, like the stuff, sociology, critical sociology, the kind of things that we were busy learning and reading about. Like how do we make this accessible to young people, for example, who've never, I don't know, had a conversation about capitalism, How do we have conversations like that and try to make and do it in accessible ways? Or when they think about what's going on in the schools, get people asking, so if our toilets aren't working, like why aren't they working? As opposed to just coming in and fixing the toilet, or asking a company if they can't come in and do something. Ask why is it like that in the first place, or who's supposed to be responsible for it. So I think that was a big shift in Bottomup. And I think to come at your question maybe a bit more directly then, and to work from that, is I think it's about being human with each other, and more than just being human, but also I think what capitalism does and what all of these oppressive systems do is they alienate us. They alienate us from our work, they alienate us from each other, they alienate us from the environment. And so when we talk about becoming human or being human in the world, is to kind of repair those relations. How do we imagine futures that, where we aren't stripping the environment of everything because we have a profit motive, where we aren't, sitting on Netflix or whatever it might be, because even our social time has been privatized in a sense. And so schools, healthcare, housing, water and sanitation, whatever it is that you think about, is all affected by these things and is all in need of repair, is all in a state of dysfunction. And so I think the work that needs to be done is how do we begin to imagine new ways of engaging in all of these different spaces and spheres, repairing those disconnections almost that's there.
That's good. Well, I know earlier on we spoke about, I think Ashley, you mentioned hope, and you both introduced me to this idea of critical hope as a concept. And my understanding is that we actually need that. We need a level of hope to achieve this new imagination. I think there's a lot of people who would say, like, a lot of people are saying South Africa is on the verge of collapse, so alarmists, people, or whatever. There's a certain agenda like that, but also like the world's crumbling around us with catastrophes, environmental stuff, political stuff, all of those kinds of things. So I guess a question about how do you maintain, or what is your kind of view of what is critical hope? How can that help us? And then Helene, you, in the same vein, you had mentioned something about this idea of the rose and the concrete or something. That's quite an interesting idea that I think reflects some of that.
Yeah, so I think the idea of critical hope, I think that does inform a lot of what we do. I think it's difficult sometimes to keep it, but I think the beginning of Bottomup was this, I think from the Andrade article, it talks about hokey hope. It's really like, we're going to keep telling you a lie, just work hard, just do the right things, and you're going to make it in this world. And I think that's what we were kind of going for, and I think that's where we got to this is false. We cannot continue to tell students this is how it's going to play out. And also for them to stop seeing themselves in the deficit view, or their parents. I mean, their parents are working really hard. That doesn't mean, but they don't always see that way. It's like, well, if my parents just made the right decisions, if they worked harder, they would be in a better position, and realizing that's not that way, and actually starting to help children, you see that. And I think that's part of critical hope, is how do we really see things for what they are, and be able together sit with that pain together, and to say, I really care about that. What can I do for my individual part? I think it's a small part, because there is still always this idea of care, but how do we change this? How do we look at this changing systemically and for the broader society? And I think specifically in the schoolwork for the critical hope is them really seeing what is the problems that are here that we want to see. Well, how can we change it? This might not even affect me as a student in school, because I might be out of school by the time we've won this problem we're working on. So it's actually working for the greater good of the next person. So for me, the critical hope is really being, firstly, telling kids the truth. But they're not getting stuck in this idea, which I think Andrade also then refers to a deferred hope, where we hope one day that everything is going to be rosy, but there is actually, we are all actually feeling really hopeless and defeated that this is not going to happen. We're not going to realize this ever. And so that also alienates you again from each other and from the system. But then really trying to put things in place or do things together, I think is supporting adult and child relationship to move forward. I think the idea is we always want to move forward and not stay stagnant in one position, and then reevaluate, are we making progress? How do we get there? So that would be my idea of critical hope. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Ashley?
I like that. I like the idea of critical hope. For me, it is about bringing two things together. It is about bringing together, on one sense, the idea that things can change through our actions that we do in the world. We're always affecting things, and so things can change. In fact, the problems that we suffer is because of people who actually made a concerted effort to put their efforts into establishing these systems. So they done through human effort, so that it can change. So there's a hopefulness about that something better is possible. But also on the other side of it, the criticality is to recognize that actually we need to understand how these things work, how they are put together, is not just kind of naive, or, let's just go and do something good, you know.
Yeah.
And maybe that's also where our work started, is kind of from that naive point of view. It's like, let's want to make a difference.
Yeah.
It's out of that. So there's a heart in that as well, and a genuineness of concern and care. But I think it needs to be married to kind of the idea of actually studying the world. So Paulo Freire also puts it that way: studying the world, reading the word and the world. For him, I think he says a lot about hope in his Pedagogy of Hope, and you had a nice quote from that as well. But I think this idea that on one sense we need hope, without hope we're paralyzed, without hope. But it's also something that is about being human. This thing that you actually, to be human is to have hope, to engage even in activities like education is an engagement in hopefulness, because otherwise why go to school, why learn about how the world works if it's not about creating or shifting things. So I think holding those two things together, there's a number of different people that, for me, that I kind of rely on also. Gramsci also has this thing of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, which is kind of the same idea. Ruth Levitas talks about utopia as a method, where we actually use this idea of thinking about, or the future becomes a resource, So it's not just thinking utopian things, but using that kind of imagination to almost question the existing reality, So the way in which we've organized things, the policies that we have, are they really helpful? Are they really useful? What would they look like differently? And I think there's glimmers of that in different things which people have, or ideas which people have put forward. They don't necessarily, upset or overthrow capitalism, but things like UBIs, universal basic income, things like participatory budgeting, questions put forward by Fees Must Fall around what does a decommodified education look like, People are playing with those ideas like that, and I think they're quite powerful ideas because they call into question the way in which we've organized society.
Yeah. I like that the glimmers, there's those glimmers of what's possible, and then I guess it is like this idea of the roses that grow out of the concrete, that even in like what seems like a wasteland, there are these moments where there are possibilities, or the gaps in reality.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Helene and Ashley. That was brilliant.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Should we hope for fish and chips now?
Fish and chips.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.